Welcome. Today we will talk about risk, rebellion, and adolescent development. Here's a quick overview of what we will discuss today, which is characteristics of adolescence, risk and rebellion in adolescent years, friendship and its implication in risk-taking behavior, underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex and risk-taking, and practical examples and implementation. Let's start with an overview of characteristics of adolescence. Simply put, adolescence is defined as the start or onset of puberty and the beginning of progression into adulthood. During this time, the adolescent grows physically, cognitively, and emotionally. The body grows rapidly in size, and sexual and reproductive organs become fully functional. At this same juncture, adolescents gain in their ability for increased abilities in reasoning, develop a strong sense of self, and forge their own identities, developing important attachments with peers. In Western societies like our own, there is great importance placed on independence, and this period can be stressful for teens, as it involves new and strong emotions, the need to develop new social relationships, and an increased sense of responsibility and independence. Risk and rebellion in adolescence. Among with many other changes, adolescents face frightening and exciting developmental challenges. This is another stage of separation and independence from parents and caregivers, echoing similar defiant behaviors which took place during their first experience of separation that occurred in their toddler years. Independence sets a path for self-discovery and identity. Who will they be? Who do they want to become? As you may recall, by the second year of life, a child has gained a sense of separation from their parents. Newly developed and somewhat mastered gross motor skills allow for physical separation, control over that separation, and therefore a degree of independence. Physical independence leads the child to become progressively more aware of that separateness of their bodies and their wants compared to their caregivers. The child will no longer be a passive participant, and each opposition is a sign of the child's independence and uniqueness. It is no wonder that parents of adolescents feel the frustrations as they once did during the terrible twos. Western societies acknowledge the difficulty of parenting an adolescent child and view adolescence as a time of rebellion. Just as in toddler years, the phase of adolescence will also subside. In my opinion, just like infancy and toddlerhood, adolescence is one of the most fascinating areas of development to study and observe within the human lifespan. Studying adolescence is where one combines biological changes along with interactions of physiological, social, and environmental factors that contribute to behavior. Let's take a quick look and remind ourselves of what some risky and rebellious behavior may look like.
TV to when my brother and I sneaked out and tried to avoid the Ring camera but didn't know my dad installed another camera that day.
Rebellion against adult rules and expectations is developmentally normal and to a certain degree expected. Adolescence is a time where there can be increased drug use, unprotected sex, and some high causes of mortality in adolescence includes accidents, homicides, and suicides. This developmental period is also marked by variations in emotionality and self-regulation. In adolescence, emotions become more intense, fluctuate more, and are more subject to extremes than those experienced by children and adults. Concurrent with these emotional changes are shifts in behavior and regulation. Peer relationships and implication on risk taking. Unlike younger children, relationships with parents is primary. Adolescents, however, devote their time and attention to peer relationships and groups. They may also attribute more importance to peer approval. Adolescent social reorientation is a term that defines the shift from parent to peer influences that takes place during adolescence. Social reorientation facilitates the necessary processes to establish independence and individuality from parents. Although social reorientation is a natural part of adolescence, the relationships with parents continues to be meaningful and important. Social reorientation is normal, but not all forms of peer interactions or friendships are beneficial to development. Many peers encourage healthy behaviors and offer risk protective relationships. Other peers, however, may encourage enlistment in antisocial and dangerous behaviors, such as unsafe driving or substance use. Increased rewards from peers in adolescence may fuel adolescent risk taking behavior, a probability supported by evidence that adolescents make riskier decisions in the presence of peers than they do when alone. Past studies involving adolescent lab mice found that they drank more alcohol in the company of same-aged cage mates. This was not found, however, in adult mice. This does suggest a cross-species evolutionary conservative tendency for adolescents to engage in more high-risk, potentially rewarding behaviors in the presence of peers. Other human studies have found that continued ties to parents appear to help limit risk taking behaviors when there is a positive parent child relationship. For example, adolescents with stronger family obligation values showed less neuronal activity to a risk taking task, which was linked in turn to fewer real life risk taking behaviors. Overall, during adolescent stages, we see increased risk behavior and susceptibility to peer influence. Because adolescents place greater importance on peer relationships, close friendships become the adolescent's primary source of social support. Adolescents that don't have close positive peer relationships are less likely to receive emotional support in times of stress. Without such support, these adolescents may be more susceptible to the negative effects that result from conflict. Social connections and support provides individuals with the psychological resources necessary to cope with stress, decreasing the probability of engaging in risking behavior as a means of coping. High levels of peer support may moderate adolescents from engaging in risky behavior. Alternatively, high levels of peer support can increase risky behavior. Adolescents with high levels of support from peers engage in greater levels of risk taking, possibly because of modeling. Studies have also shown that adolescent peer groups that have high levels of support have been associated with substance use and delinquency. This may be due to the nature of the peer relationships, such that peers tend to focus on social activities with positive, pleasurable qualities that can also be spontaneous and impulsive as well. Social rewards can be derived from these behavior. Social rewards are expected and have high positive affect in peer settings. This is critical to understanding adolescents' engagement and participation in risky behavior. Both behavioral and neuroscience research supports adolescents' intense sensitivity to reward in peer contexts. Brain maturation in the prefrontal cortex. The frontal lobes are roughly a third of the human brain. The prefrontal cortex includes half of the entire frontal lobe. Evidence indicates that this area of the brain is responsible for higher cognitive functions and includes language, intelligence, and reasoning. In addition, pathways that are connected to the prefrontal cortex are critical in activities like attention and cognitive control. This area of the brain relies heavily on connections and connectivity to other areas of the brain, meaning the brain is a structure composed of many cell types densely interconnected in complex ways. The prefrontal cortex exhibits great growth in adolescent years. The neurons within these areas also change in color and function. As this area of the brain develops, neurons and their axons will become myelinated. Neurons in the prefrontal cortex develop most between adolescence and into the mid-20s. Neuroimaging has given visual evidence that during adolescence, together with maturation of cognitive functions, the prefrontal cortex appears more white as it undergoes these enormous changes. You may ask yourself, how does myelination change the color visually of the human brain? Myelin is a fatty substance that surrounds the axon of the neuron, located here. The prefrontal cortex will change in its accumulation of gray matter, and with myelination will change to white matter. As you may recall, myelination, this substance aids in speeding up impulses. This allows neurons to communicate more rapidly and in coordination. In this way, the prefrontal cortex becomes more coordinated with other regions of the frontal lobe. Past research tells us that the adolescent brain has less neurons, dendrite branches, and synapses than the adult brain. This will change, and there will be an increase into the mid to late 20s. This change is not new, as the human brain has undergone this type of change before, during fetal stages. The fetal brain has more neurons than the adult brain, but has less synaptic connections and fewer myelinated neurons. Those that were not used will undergo pruning, while others were strengthened. This is reoccurring in the adolescent prefrontal cortex. Similar competitive pruning and myelinization. The prefrontal cortex does not start losing the volume of gray matter until late adolescence. Studies have shown a landmark pattern in which children were neuroimaged and tested repeatedly into adulthood. It was found that the longer the duration and accumulation of gray matter thickness in early adolescence before pruning began equated to higher IQs in adulthood. Due to underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex, it allows for other areas of the brain to mature and relies on them in ways that the prefrontal cortex will in the future. For example, the adolescent brain uses the ventral striatum to regulate emotions, but in adult years, the prefrontal cortex will take over these controls. The ventral striatum is a vital part responsible for decision-making and reward-related behaviors. Across many species, including rodents, non-human primates, and humans, we see increased dopamine signals peak during adolescence. Dopamine, simply put, are happy hormones. This influences and alters motivation behavior. For instance, adolescents exhibit greater ventral striatum activation than children or adults when receiving or anticipating social rewards. This includes attempts to avoid social punishments as well. Conformity to peers may drive, in part, by desire to obtain social rewards and avoid social punishments, which is associated with ventrum striatum sensitivity. Ventral striatum processes can account for both motivation in positive and negative contexts. We can see heightened ventral striatum activity in risk-taking behaviors, particularly in the presence of peers or where social rewards can be acquired. This is associated with compromised cognitive controls and increased risk-taking. This is an example of how less activity in the prefrontal cortex can lead to poor decision-making. Ventral striatum is associated with rewards and therefore affects the way adolescents make decisions. Moving on, we'll talk about practical examples and implementation. Located in the Sierra Nevada mountains here in California, the Moaning Cave, although beautiful, has a 180-foot drop. Today, sightseers can explore the cave by rappelling or by taking the stairs. Originally, when the cave was discovered, skeletal remains of adolescents were found at the bottom, some dating back 12,000 years. Again, this is another powerful example about how lower prefrontal cortex activation, or lack thereof, leads to flawed risk assessment. Today, the cave offers tours, rock climbing, and zip lining for thrill seekers. Social media allows users to feel less alone. Users post videos and photos to elicit peer acceptance, something adolescents seek. Research into the adolescent brain has highlighted that evenings is when teens are most active on social media and therefore more likely to engage with challenges without their family's knowledge. As you may know, the adolescent brain is more vulnerable to not thinking through decisions, being impulsive, and easily led by influence of social rewards. Sadly, a 12-year-old boy died after nearly 3 weeks of being on life support after participating in a dangerous TikTok challenge. Pictured below is Joshua. He was discovered unconscious after choking himself in a challenge on TikTok, best known as, by several names, the Blackout Challenge, Pass Out Challenge, the Game of Choking, Speed Dreaming, and the Faint Game. The Colorado native spent 19 days on life support before his death. Sadly, Joshua is not unique in being injured by media challenges. As prevention for one challenge comes to fruition, a new challenge emerges. Research into the adolescent brain has highlighted that let's apply this idea of social rewards. During this stage, there is a need to feel accepted by peers. This may help us in understanding why this group is most likely to engage or be victims of hazing. Hazing and/or initiation can refer to activities that are expected of someone in joining a group, such as fraternity and sports teams. These activities include acts that are meant to humiliate, degrade, abuse, or endanger someone regardless of their willingness to participate. Many of these activities can include drinking unsafe amounts of alcohol, sex acts, and physical punishment such as paddling, branding, and sleep deprivation. California and many other states make hazing illegal and criminal and can result in a misdemeanor or felony charges. Other states, it's not only a crime to engage in hazing, but it's also a crime to know about the hazing and not report. Yet, these dangerous practices continue. Here are some things you should ask yourself before participating in an activity. Is this worth the risk? Is this illegal? Is this dangerous? Can this hurt myself or others?